Hello, Modus. Uh, when we last left off, we were talking about the overthrow of the Queen of Hawaii by uh, the planters, the planter class. And I wanted to take a moment to kind of go over that because I feel like we ended rather abruptly. And I want to make sure we're clear. Uh, so I want to spend just a few minutes going back and talking about that. Here in this picture, we see Queen Liliuokalani in black because she's in mourning. Um, what's happened is this is after her government has been overthrown. Uh, the man that's responsible for this is a man named Sanford Dole. Dole is part of the family that he's from the branch of the family that's responsible for Dole pineapples, the Dole Fruit Company. I think he's a nephew of that family. He is the first president of the Republic of Hawaii. He actually is made president because a group of planters convinced the United States ambassador to use Marines to help overthrow the Queen. The Marines do not actually use any of their weapons. They basically just threaten. They land with their rifles, their Gatling guns, their cannon, and just the fact that they are marching through town with all of these weapons, looking really threatening, very professional, convinces the native population from actually interfering. And so when the rebel leaders declare a new government, the Queen is forced to step down. She does not want to do this. She steps down under protest, realizing that if she actually responds, that the Marines actually could fire on her people. However, the president at the time, President Garfield, realizes that this is, well, frankly, I guess the phrase I used in the last lecture was dirty pool, that it's not fair, that this is diplomatically unsound, that there's a lot of pressure, outside pressure. There's people that think that this was not fair and not right. And so he does not actually recognize the annexation of Hawaii. Because of this, however, he is not actually willing to, because he's not willing to annex it, he's still not willing to say that to give it back to the Queen. So what he does is he recognizes the Republic of Hawaii. So it just kind of stays in this kind of no man's land. It's its own country for about 4 years. When Garfield leaves office, the new president, William McKinley, is a very, very ardent imperialist, and one of the first things he does is annex the islands. And so because of that, Hawaii becomes the first target of U.S. imperialism. This is the beginning of that road that I mentioned about hubris, and this is the first step. It starts in the Pacific. If you remember, Alfred Mahan said the first thing we need to do is establish naval bases in the Pacific. Well, we now have our naval bases in the Pacific with Hawaii. That will soon, we will get more in the Pacific, but now we have the first big one. Now we need to start looking to naval bases in the Caribbean. First place we're going to look is another island paradise. Here we see the island of Cuba. Cuba had been a Spanish possession since Columbus. It was considered the prize of Spain for 400 years. Although slavery had been abolished, the Spanish still denied Cubans their independence, and they ruled pretty oppressively. The Cubans we were quite interested in Cuba. The U.S. had an interest in Cuba, and many Americans identified with the Cubans. They saw similarities between Great Britain and Spain. For instance, Great Britain was a monarchy, Spain was a monarchy. The Cubans were trying to overthrow the Spanish, just like the United States overthrew the British. Um, for others, it was a matter of dollar signs. They looked at Cuba and looked at this and thought, well, here's another place we could get cheap sugar. If we could kick Spain out, then U.S. planters could replace the Spanish as landowners. So there were political reasons why we looked at them. There were economic reasons why we looked at them, and finally there were social reasons why we looked at them. One of the most famous poets of the day was a man named Jose Marti. And Jose Marti came to New York City and wrote poems and spoke eloquently about the need for Cuban independence. And he was so popular that he raised a lot of money, which was used to buy guns and support for his homeland while he was in New York City. Ironically, when he went back to Cuba, he was killed in one of the first battles that he fought in. But that's another story. In 1895, when Martí returns home, he begins a guerrilla campaign against the Spanish. In case we're not familiar with the word guerrilla campaign, what we mean is a campaign where the people who are gunned, who don't have the same capabilities as their opponents, use tactics which are kind of hit and run tactics. They hide, they hit, and then they run away. They fade away. So they burn sugar fields, they destroy mills, and then they fade into the jungle, or they fade into the sugar fields that they have started to burn. They actually fight Spanish troops all over the island. It actually has some terrible results, because the Spanish send a man named Commander Valeriano Weyler, who begins what's called a reconcentration policy. That should sound familiar, because essentially what he means by reconcentration policy are concentration camps. Only it's a little different than the concentration camps we're familiar with, because instead of putting the bad guys into concentration camps, or quote-unquote bad guys, he puts the quote-unquote good Cubans into concentration camps. He says, I want all of the Cuban civilians to go into these concentration areas, and anybody that I don't find in a reconcentration area, or reconcentrado, after a certain date, I will assume as an enemy of Spain, and I will shoot them. What ends up happening is over 25% of the Cuban population ends up being imprisoned, and over 300,000 die as a result of bad sanitation and starvation. The Cuban economy ends up destroyed because there's so many people in these reconcentrados that no one can actually do the farming. And Weyler himself ends up being recalled back to Spain in disgrace. So it's a total failure. Thousands or hundreds of thousands die. It's a complete failure. It's horrible. Stories of Cuban mistreatment are rampant. There are reports of potential millions of dollars being burned up because of the war, and U.S. investors in Cuba start calling for intervention. McKinley, who is the U.S. president, if you remember, who annexed Hawaii and who actually said we need to annex the Virgin Islands as well, he tries to avoid a war. So, and that's important, because this guy clearly likes to take stuff over. But if he's actually saying, let's put on the brakes here, guys. If he's saying we need to wait a second, that's telling you he really doesn't want to jump headfirst into a war. So he says, let's wait a second, guys. Look, Spain is trying to reform its government. It's pulled Weyler out. It's stopped the concentration camps. Let's hold off a second. But then this happens. If you look carefully at this painting, or drawing, I should say, you'll notice what we're looking at here is an artist rendering of the destruction of the U.S. battleship Maine, which happened in Havana Harbor in February of 1898. some people in other classes have pointed out that it's almost kind of hilarious how the propaganda that you see in this with the people flying through the air, and it really is meant to try and evoke an emotional reaction on the part of the people who see this, right? You see people flying. These are U.S. soldiers, excuse me, U.S. sailors. So I mean, it really is meant to evoke a reaction in the people who see this. Oh my gosh, look at these men who've been blown literally sky high. And it should be noted, we don't know what this really looked like. So this is really just an imaginative view of what could have happened. All hopes of peace vanish in early 1898 as riots broke out in Havana. Here's what happened. The riots break out for an odd reason. The riots actually broke out not from the Cubans, but because of the Spanish soldiers. The Spanish soldiers begin rebelling because the Spanish government decided to give the Cuban people more freedom. So the Spanish soldiers began rebelling. In January, the United States government sent the USS Maine down to protect Americans and, quote, American interests. Now, if you remember, anytime you hear the phrase American interests, you should immediately think money. Because Americans, when we think about American interests, usually that means something economic. And on February 15th, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and 260 sailors were killed. Immediately, American newspapers went crazy. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," were headlines that were featured in William Hearst newspapers across the country. It was deliberately designed to provoke a reaction. Most Americans thought Spain had done the dirty deed. Yes, I deliberately made that AC/DC joke there. But no evidence could prove that Spain had done this. Really, honestly, it doesn't make sense for Spain to do this, because at this point, Spain was really a third-rate world power, and America was on the rise. So for them to deliberately provoke this response from us was kind of them writing their own death certificate. A later naval investigation assigned blame to a mine, but didn't actually say it was Spain's. The damage was done, though. Americans immediately called for war. What you're looking at here is a newspaper. If you look up at the top, you'll notice the headline. This is from The World, one of the leading newspapers during this time. And if you look carefully, you'll notice it says, "Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo." Already, they're assigning blame. The matter is not a matter of could this have been an internal explosion? The matter has already been decided. It's not a matter of how the Maine exploded. It's a matter of how did the Spanish do it? Did they do it by a bomb, or did they do it by a torpedo? This is a matter of something called, this is an example of something called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism, which again is one of the terms on your list, is something that helps provoke the Spanish-American War. Yellow journalism is honestly kind of the mirror image of that other thing that we saw during the Progressive era. It's if you remember, muckraking was that idea of journalism which was designed to provoke a response in the reader by exposing the horrors that were underneath American society to the light of day. It was supposed to hit you in the gut. And the result was change in society. The difference between yellow journalism and muckraking: yellow journalism provokes a response too, and it's gonna cause a change in society. There's just one difference between yellow journalism and muckraking. Yellow journalism is not necessarily true. Yellow journalism gets its name from a series of cartoons that are kind of weird. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture, when we continue, and we'll start talking more about the Spanish-American War when we return. Thanks for listening, and we'll pick up from this when we come back.